Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Marketing Live for Tuesday, March 19th, 2019. Thanks for your patience. We are on the air now. I'm Rob Zickin. I serve as Associate Vice President for Marketing at Indiana University. Today's topic is a very important and relevant one: transfer receptivity, transforming culture and the student experience. And we have a distinguished panel of guests. I'll introduce them momentarily. They're doing some really fantastic work in this area. First, a brief reminder that Marketing Live is part of the Higher Ed Live network. Our episodes offer you direct access to the best and brightest minds in education. You can be a part of our live broadcast today. Use the Higher Ed Live hashtag on Twitter, join the discussion, and feel free to send any questions that you may have for our guests. All episodes are free and easy to access in the video archives at higheredlive.com, or you can take Higher Ed Live with you on the go by subscribing to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And if you happen to miss last Friday's Higher Ed Live special edition episode on College for Sale that included Eric Hoover from the Chronicle and several others, definitely check out the podcast. Well, I'm looking forward to our discussion today and glad that we got everyone connected and can be all together and talk about transfer receptive culture. So let's go ahead and meet our guests. Let's start with Janet Marling. Janet is Executive Director of the National Institute for the Study of Transfer Students. And I'll ask each of you if you could share a little bit about your role and how you came to the work of transfer. And Janet, let's kick things off with you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rob. I've been affiliated with the Institute, the National Institute for the Study of Transfer Students, since its inception in 2002. We are located at the University of North Georgia and have really found a calling to assist our transfer students in their academic journeys and helping the professionals that support them, the faculty, the staff, the administrators, to really understand transfer such that we can help these students achieve their goals.
Excellent. Next, Alfred Herrera, Assistant Vice Provost for Academic Partnerships and Director of UCLA's Center for Community College Partnerships. Welcome, Alfred. And I understand you're missing a pancake breakfast with your students, so a special thank you for taking time to join. And tell us a bit about your role and your involvement in this topic.
Good morning from California. So I've been working at UCLA for 38 years, and most of that time focused on transfer students. In 2001, I created the Center for Community College Partnerships, which focuses on empowering and motivating students, helping them prepare for university like UCLA.
Great. And Dimple Jan is Associate Professor of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at California State University, Northridge. Welcome, Dimple. And a bit more about your work, your role, and your involvement in this area as well.
Thank you. I have been working with community college students and transfer students since 2001. I started at Seattle Central Community College, and then I joined UCLA and was able to work for the Center for Community College Partnerships and to build a research agenda related to practice with and for transfer students.
Excellent. And last but certainly not least, Mark Allen Poisel, Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs at the University of Arkansas Little Rock. Welcome, Mark Allen, and your background in terms of your work in this area and a bit more about your role at Arkansas Little Rock.
Sure. So as the Vice Chancellor, I'm over the entire Student Affairs Division, and I have been in higher education for 30 years. My first interaction working with transfer students was back in 1999 as an academic advisor for a college of business who focused on transfer students. And then my first really big break was in '99 when I was selected as Director of Transfer Services. I've also been very fortunate to be a part of the National Institute for the Study of Transfer Students on their advisory board since the beginning.
Great. Well, welcome again to everyone, and glad to have this group together and to share some information and background and what's ahead on this, again, very important work in serving transfer students. And let's start there and go back to you, Janet, in terms of why is this topic so important? Why should we be talking about focusing on learning more about transfer students?
Well, first of all, transfer, we believe, is a vital mechanism for closing that racial and equity racial gap, the income equity gap that we see in higher education. Collectively, transfer students are typically from historically underrepresented groups, first generation, our low income students, as well as students 22 years of age and over. And these are students who oftentimes start their academic journeys at the community college as a very viable option for them. And we want to ensure their abilities then to transfer to a four-year institution to pursue that baccalaureate and then graduate. So transfer is really important in closing those equity gaps. Second, mobility is reality. Students are moving. 38% of current students in higher education will attend more than one institution. And whenever you think about that, that's over 1 million students who are trying to either move themselves or their credits in between institutions with varying levels of success. And part of the reason that success varies is because transfer is tremendously complex. When you think about it from a student perspective, they bring their own backgrounds, their histories, their resources to the table. And institutions have varying missions. They have varying levels of resources, personnel to be equipped to handle those students. So therefore, it's really important that we look at this issue of transfer holistically. And we believe that one of the most important ways in mitigating that complexity is to really start with the transfer receptive culture. And that's what we're here to talk about today.
Great. And I think you're exactly right in terms of the complexities and the fact that the onus is often on the student when it comes to transferring and having to figure out all these complexities and work through complexities on their own. So again, super important work that you and your colleagues are doing. And as we level set here and get an understanding of the topic and area, I'll ask Dimple if you could give us a sense of the various types of transfer as we learn more about this area.
Absolutely. There are so many different types of transfer. The transfer landscape is pretty vast. Today, we're going to be focusing on vertical transfer, which is transfer from a community college to a university. But there are multiple kinds. There's lateral transfer, so either from one university to another, most likely within a system. There's reverse transfer, where a student may go from a university back to a community college. There's reverse credit transfer, where students will be able to be awarded credits from the community college while already at the university. There's swirling, where students are attending multiple institutions, alternating courses, and usually their transfer journey involves definitely more than one community college on the route to get there. And then lastly, there's dual enrollment. And dual enrollment is usually for those in our secondary sector in high school that are enrolled in high school and are taking community college classes at the same time. So right there, that's just 6 different types. And I know there's a couple more on top of that.
Okay. Thank you for laying all of that out for us. And I'll ask for some further education here because we've used the phrase transfer receptive culture a few times already. And you and Alfred break that down for us. What is a transfer receptive culture when we use that phrase?
Yeah. Would you like to do this, Alfred, or would you like me to?
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, transfer receptive culture started with the work of UCLA's and the Center for Community College Partnerships. It formally began, as Alfred was saying, in 2001, but the work of transfer and the idea of a university centralizing and receiving transfer students as a normal thing to do, not an exceptional thing to do, has been around for quite some time. But the idea of writing about it and theorizing about it has come more recently. And so how we're defining transfer receptive culture in the publications that we've put out is that it's an institutional commitment by a university to help students navigate the community college, take the appropriate coursework, apply, enroll, and successfully earn a baccalaureate degree or beyond at the university. So this is not what you had mentioned earlier, Rob. This is not on the student. This is on the institution. It's the institutional commitment. And we also are theorizing transfer receptive culture. It's grounded in critical race theory, which centers the experiences of race and racism in the transfer process. As we know, community colleges across the nation serve about half of students of color that are in higher ed. So it's really important that we do look at the student of color experience in the transfer process.
And Alfred, would you like to expand on that at all and perhaps share a little bit about how you've created that type of culture, a transfer receptive culture at UCLA?
Sure. So for me, the issue has always been when I first started at UCLA, I was a recruiter. So I would go out and meet with students and try to figure out how to help them get to UCLA or another university. And I often found that the onus for transfer was always on the community college, and that as four-year representatives, we were expected to show up and see students and then leave. So I always wondered what our role was and why it wasn't that we were more engaged in that process to figure out how do we help students better understand our institution, but more importantly, how do we help our institutions better understand the students that we're trying to attract. So over the course of the years, as Dimple mentioned, when I first started the center in 2001, we began to look at what kind of a responsibility the university has to attracting students, but more importantly, to make sure that they're successful and they excel and they succeed in completing their degree and moving forward. So we began to do work, and as a practitioner, for me, it was just, let's do this work, let's just do it. And we were doing it, and we were doing great work. And then Dimple came along and said, no, you need to publish this work. You need to let people know what you're doing because it's great work. There are a lot of things going on. So we began looking at that, and our first piece was in 2011. And the idea is that we as four-year universities need to really think about what it means to be welcoming and receptive to transfer students. It's not just about recruiting them. It's about the support services that are available. It's about all of the scholarship, financial aid, all the things that are part of that success. So looking at what are we delivering for students and making available for them so that they can be successful and move forward with their lives once they graduate and move on to either a career or graduate school.
And I'm at a four-year institution as well, and that being the focus of the discussion in terms of vertical transfers. But as Dimple talked about, there are all sorts of different types of transfers. So how does this type of culture, a transfer receptive culture, potentially differ from a two-year institution to a four-year institution?
So the focus on what we call a transfer receptive culture is really building on what is already there for students that come in as freshman students. So the reality is most of our universities are geared for students coming in right out of high school. So all of the services that are developed, all of the support programs, all of the scholarship and financial aid that is available is really geared to students who come in at that level. So what we're trying to do is to help the institution understand that there is this great group of people who have lived experience, who have lived lives, who have this wealth of resources, something that we call community cultural wealth, that they bring with them. And it's important for us to recognize that. So in order to recognize that, you need to provide opportunities for them. I'll give you an example. Orientation. This is one of my biggest ones. Orientation for students who come right out of high school is usually 2 or 3 days. You stay overnight, you go through tours, you meet everybody in the world at the institution. It's great. Transfer student orientation is 3 hours or 5 hours. Rarely is it overnight, except in the last few years that's changed. So what's the problem there? Well, the problem is that everybody assumes transfer students already know what they need to do, but they're at a different institution. There's all of this new complex programming that's there that they have no idea how to get to. So the idea of providing that support is important. Many of our students come as parents. And what are we doing to help those students with childcare, with all other kinds of resources that they need? Non-traditional students, veteran students, all of these experiences that they bring with them need to have support programs for them. So it's really important for us to take a look at what we're doing at our institution to make them welcome and receptive to these students, rather than just putting a Band-Aid on it by having them join an already existing program that's geared for students coming right out of high school.
Rob, if I may.
Please, yes.
I think too, your question also centered on looking at that 2-year, and what does a transfer receptive culture look like at a 2-year institution? And whereas this theory is looking at that 2-year to 4-year transfer, sometimes our community colleges are seen only as ascending institutions. So they're preparing students to move forward. We're seeing now with the different types of transfer that they're also receiving institutions. And that's so very important for our 2-year partners to understand, is that their roles are very complex in this transfer process, because now they're not only sending, but they're also receiving. They're thinking about how they're preparing culture, but also then that culture that is trying to help those new students adapt as well. It gets very complex.
And I also wanted to circle back to Dimple's earlier point and mentioning that critical race theory and its role in informing the definition of a transfer receptive culture. And Dimple, could you expand on that? I'm sure we could spend a lot of time getting a better understanding of that, but to better understand how critical race theory informs this work and understanding and how it has helped your work and the evolution of this work to help transfer students.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was doing transfer research in terms of peer-reviewed, publicly available scholarship, what I saw was that there was a lack of theorizing. Often the way that we see transfer is through an atheoretical lens. And so when I was looking at issues of inequity within the higher ed pipeline, and I realized that race and racism was such an important component of that, critical race theory was a natural fit to help us look at transfer through this theoretical lens. And the way that we define critical race theory in education. So critical race theory itself is a theoretical framework that came from critical legal studies, post-civil rights, late 60s, early 70s. And then it was brought over to education, I would say, in the early 90s. And it is a framework that accounts for the role of race and racism to help explain educational inequity. It looks at systemic racism and institutional racism, and higher ed being one of those institutions. Higher ed having a very historically racist legacy when it comes to access, when it comes to retention, when it comes to services. And transfer is not immune to that at all. And so really using CRT to look at how transfer students, how their identities matter and how their lived experiences matter as well. So it's not just that race matters when we look at transfer students. Often we use proxies, we use socioeconomic status, we use first-gen status, but we explicitly use race as a way to make sure that we're also accounting for the accompanying racism that can happen in the transfer process. Again, the institutional racism, so racism that can be enacted by staff, faculty, fellow students, and how much that impacts those 6 different forms of transfer and their journey from one institution to another institution.
And Janet, thank you for jumping in earlier. Anyone, feel free if you have something to add. Don't wait to be prompted by me. I know we've got a lot to cover, so feel free, anyone, to jump in if you've got something to add. And I also want to go back to Alfred's point and shared some good examples in terms of this type of culture, and the example about orientation, for instance. And how do you assess whether or not your institution does indeed have a transfer receptive culture?
Well, I think there are different ways of doing that. And one of them is just to take a kind of an inventory of available services that are specific to transfer. So one of the things that we've been doing over the last few months and the last year is a couple of things. One of them is a mapping. So we began to look at on our campus, what spaces do we have on our campus that are really specific in supporting transfer students. So identifying maybe the 4, 5, 10, 20 different places on this campus that specifically serve transfer students intentionally. And then we also look at places that are somewhat friendly, but may not be focused specifically on transfer, but that they do a lot of work and it's focused on some of that on the experiences of transfer students. And then looking at what other places should be transfer friendly that may not be. So helping this, develop this inventory is important because it gives you a sense of where on your campus those hotspots are, or those friendly places are. The other piece of that then would be then to take a look at what services are available. So if you take an inventory of your campus and you say, we have scholarships available. Well, how many scholarships are specific to transfer students? How many to parenting students? Do they have to compete with students who are freshmen or current students to get those scholarships? So is it specific to them, or are they just part of this larger group that could apply for that? Looking at support service, is there a transfer center on your campus? Is there a place for people to go to, students to go to get support, to get help, to get referred to other places? Is it intentional? Is it in the middle of the campus or on the fringes of the campus? What other kinds of programs and services are available to students? Is there a place for parenting students? Do you have childcare? What about housing? Is housing guaranteed for transfer students like it usually is for freshman students? If it is, for how many years? What about family student housing? Because as I said, many of our students bring families with them, whether they're children, spouses, or parents or others that they're caring for. So is that intentional in providing direct services and support? So looking at the kinds of things that are available to the transfer student at your institution gives you some examples of what you need to develop in order to make it more receptive. The other part of that is those are all support services, but what about on the academic side? What kinds of experiences do your students have in the classroom? And that oftentimes is really telling about support, because there are faculty that don't believe transfer students are as smart as students who come in as freshmen, and that the reason they go to a community college is because they can't make it to a university, when in fact, we know that's not true. We know the research shows that they do as well, if not better, than students who start as first-year freshman students at the institution. So what kinds of attitudes are there from faculty about your transfer students? What kinds of attitudes are there from your administrators about students that come in as transfer? So taking a look at all of those kinds of, determine where your campus lies with regards to this receptive culture, and looking at different ways that you can help change that.
Excellent. And I'll pose this as a follow-up for anyone to chime in, Alfred, Dimple, Mark Allen, anyone who wants to share a perspective. As I think about some of those considerations that you just shared, Alfred, as someone here at Indiana University and our 7 campuses, or perhaps a listener and thinking about his or her institution and going through those different considerations that you discussed, and start to realize, wow, we've got some work to do. How do you recommend, or where might you recommend beginning to get a better sense of the work that needs to be done?
So we've developed some action steps and some tools that we're working on that we'll be making public really soon. But the idea is, again, starting with that inventory, to take a look at what's out there and to see what is available on your campus already. Secondly, then you have to find your allies. You look for people who are supportive of this kind of new programming or new support services. So starting at the top, obviously, one of the tenets or the elements of our transfer receptive culture is high institutional priority. So where does that start? Is it at the campus level where the chancellor or president is, and what is his or her attitude towards transfer? Looking at the other administrators, looking at faculty, looking at support services, and so forth. So begin to identify allies that you know who are supportive and have developed programming and support for students, starting there, making it a part of the institutional fabric, to find a committee so that you can begin to build a transfer team that will help develop these kinds of things. And I think most importantly, don't forget the student, because oftentimes as administrators and educators, we often think we know what's good for students, and many times we do. But we oftentimes leave the student perspective out. So actually having students involved in the process the entire way is a good way to assure that we are doing the things that we know need to happen in order to support the students.
I think it's important, and following up with Alfred, is in talking with those students, you begin to get a sense of where the critical priorities need to lie. The students are the ones that have gone through the experience. So they might know that you've got certain areas that require you to start there first, help you determine that prioritization. Sometimes you can't do it all in one shot, but they're the ones that are living it day to day. They've been through the process. They bring a very valuable perspective that helps the group that's going to work on this process understand that, hey, this might be a place to start first. This might be the place to start second, so that it takes kind of that practical approach. More importantly, if it's something that needs to be fixed right away, whether it's a transfer credit evaluation, whether it's scholarships, whether it's, hey, I just can't figure out how to do the admissions application, that helps the institution begin to figure out where the weaknesses are and look for that low-hanging fruit, right? You want to be successful from the beginning, particularly as you think about making change at the institution. Those little successes, bringing those people together, finding all your allies is going to help move that project forward if you can find some ways to show these little successes that impact the students directly, because truly it is about their success.
Rob, I also think that sometimes professionals think, well, how can I influence this process? We're talking about a systemic change, and we're thinking that the institution has to grab on this from the administrative level, and that is true. But we also want to empower our individual professionals to be a part of this process. And sometimes for those individuals, just getting knowledgeable about transfer is really important. So I want to point folks to a resource a book that Mark Allen has just put forward as one of the co-editors, and it's Building a Transfer Student Pathway for College and Career Success. And for those listeners who might be interested in just dipping their toe into the water about transfer and what we can be thinking about related to mobility, related to assessment, classroom connectivity, etc., I think it's just a really great starting point for individuals who might want to learn a little bit more about transfer such that they can influence the culture at their institutions.
Great. Thank you, Janet, for sharing that resource. And Mark Allen, I wanted to return to your point about some of these small wins or successes along the way when you're trying to make this part of the organization's fabric. And if you're not there, obviously change is required, a change in culture to some extent, and change can be difficult, as we know, in higher education and elsewhere, and especially with the many pressures and market forces at play right now for colleges and universities. So when facing multiple institutional priorities and having to really devote substantial change to creating that type of culture and making this part of the organizational fabric, how do you navigate that type of change that's required to get on a better path towards a transfer receptive culture?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. I think first we have to understand that culture can be very powerful on campuses. In some cases, very ingrained over time. It could be culture of the community around that. And so we just need to recognize that up front, that culture does dictate many things. It doesn't mean it can't be changed. It's just something we have to understand. We need to understand the history of the institution so that we can build better programs. I think the most important thing, and I think probably the most powerful thing about that, is that we have to remind everybody we work with that it's not about us, it's about the students and their success, and which is truly what education is all about. And so in our conversations about changing an institution, we have to realize who the audience is, right? It is our students. And so how do we make sure that our students are successful in everything that they do? And so that's a key thing, is that component. The other component is helping the institution understand why a change is going to make things better, whether it's from an enrollment perspective, whether it's from a retention or graduation perspective. People appreciate the use of data to help them understand. We want to do, Alfred's advice was some of the best, is you've got to get those allies. Allies together can build a cultural shift and a cultural change. I often talk about when you're trying to promote programs or do things, you've got to get people together, take a friend to lunch, and talk about the stories of your students. Because the more that we tell about the students and their experiences, the more people are willing to help us be successful. Most people got into education because they wanted to make the difference in the life of a student, right? Whether it's through teaching, whether it's through service. And so we just need to bring that back to the reason we exist. And then just focus on the fact that a lot of our culture is bureaucratic. It's the way we've always done it, as opposed to what's really right for the student. And it's a prioritization. It's being very intentional about what we want to accomplish, how we want to accomplish it. And that helps. It's an intentional plan, what we can do, what's our action plan that Alfred mentioned, so that we bite it off a little bit at a time, so we can show our successes, we can show our progress, we can ensure that we are making a difference and people see it. If we tell the story of our work, we tell the story of the students, people will begin to buy in, then they will want to be a part of the change.
Such great advice. Storytelling is and can be so powerful. And Mark Allen, as you look ahead to the future of transfer and how this work will continue to unfold in terms of building a transfer receptive culture, what do you see happening and how will this continue to evolve?
Well, first of all, I think that there's so many changing demographics in higher education right now that if we're going to be successful and sustainable, we have to change. It's not really an option as we look at the demographics of our students and who they are, as we look at the changes in higher education. We have to make our campuses receptive to all of our students coming in. We've got to make sure they've got the support services they need. We have to make sure that they've got the relationships built with the faculty and the staff and the other students. And so we have to find ways in order to help our students be successful. When we think about access and we think about social mobility and we think about even economic development, it's going to require all of us to find whatever minor ways it might be that we can take a student from their secondary system, get them into higher education, support them through higher education, financially, academically, socially, and culturally, so that they can progress to get that baccalaureate degree. That's the only way we're going to be successful. That's the only way we're going to move the needle when it comes to increasing access and retention and graduation, is understanding that our focus has got to be on the student and what the student needs, and being willing to change with that, understanding that our students today are different. They have different expectations. They want to be taught differently. They have different access to resources than they've had in the past. And so putting all of that together is going to be so important if the institution wants to sustain itself. I mean, if we look, every week in the Chronicle, somebody's talking about an institution that's either in trouble, that's closed, that's not sustainable, that's merging. Again, change is where we are in higher education, and I think our students are going to expect it and demand it. I don't think it's going to be an option.
If I could jump in as well, I think
Yes.
I think the reality is we have to look at the demographics, and if you look at what communities are growing, the Latino community is growing fast. If you look just in California, but also other places, we have so many students that are ready to be educated that for whatever reasons are left out of the pipeline, from the point of middle to elementary to middle to high school, and those that don't continue on. You look at the pipeline and the numbers, the harsh reality is that we're losing so many students. So we need to do something to help students get to college, and that means for many of them community college, and then move on. And if our institutions do not recognize the need, then we're going to continue to have some of the challenges that we face today. If you look at the Native American population and the Pacific Islander population as examples, less than 1% of their population are in higher education. That's astonishing and disturbing when you look at how many of those community members are eligible. So looking at ways that our institutions can be more welcoming to those communities. So it's not about the typical old educating everyone for whatever sake. It's about looking culturally, looking at the community, looking at how important it is for us to educate all of our community members in a different way, looking at how important our culture. I go back to the community cultural wealth and Tara Yoso's work. The reality is that we have so many strengths that we get from our own values, our own culture, our own education, and our own community. And universities do not recognize those as strengths, but we all know That's what gets most of us through these higher education systems. So using that cultural wealth as a strength and a motivator to move forward is what we need to continue to teach our students, because that's the only way we're going to continue to make this change.
Excellent. And I'd like to close going back to Janet in terms of what the Institute is doing and continues to do in its role and any other resources that she might recommend. But first, want to make sure that we covered with the group if there was anything else that you didn't have an opportunity to share that you wanted to, or any other pieces of advice or recommendations that you might have for colleges and universities and our listeners who are probably nodding their head to a lot of things here this afternoon and realizing some of the work that they and their institutions need to do.
I think I have just one comment. I want to follow up what Janet said. You don't have to be the president to invoke change at your institution. I think that the key thing is to find out where you are and make change there, whether it's an advisor who works one-on-one with a student, whether you're a member of a committee, whether you're a director creating a center. Everybody has an important role to play, and it may not be the same role, but make a difference from where you are, because that's what affects the students. Making that little bit of difference, that one student that you help that you can now use to build a program is going to change everything. And it's got to start there, and everybody can play a role.
I think I'll jump in. So I think one thing that we can also leave those who are listening in and those who are watching, in terms of reducing the stigma around community colleges and around transfer, and seeing transfer as a really smart choice, a really strategic choice, and a really informed choice. I know in the higher ed community, the buzz last week was this admissions scandal, right? In terms of wealthy families trying to bribe their way into elite colleges, right? And where are community colleges in that conversation? Why aren't we seeing them as valid sites of knowledge learning and knowledge production that are open access? And again, where more than half the students of color across the nation are enrolled. So how can we as university practitioners and university faculty inform students and inform community members that community colleges are amazing institutions where there's so much curricular innovation and so much to learn and gain from that part of our higher ed pipeline, and to see transfer as a really strong bridge between two different types of institutions, primarily, again, for better access and better retention for students of color.
And I would only add that I think that in addition to the programming and the support services and all of those things that we've talked about, also about policy. So I think one of the things that I always tell people is to think about what kinds of committees you're on at your institution. Because if you're not on the committee that's having a conversation about what's going on with transfer, then you're being left out. So beginning to position yourself, or someone in the institution to position themselves to be able to be that voice for transfer is really critical, because if not, you're under the table and not at the table. So it's really important to find your way into different places on that campus where your voice is going to be important as a voice for students as well.
Yep, indeed, such an important point. So Janet, let's circle back to the Institute then, and going forward, its role in advancing transfer.
Bottom line, NISTS believes that transfers need champions, and you've heard from three of the most vocal and prominent transfer champions as members of our advisory board. And we really believe that it is the practitioner, the faculty member, and the administrator that we want to empower to be those transfer champions. We encourage those at all levels of the institution to really examine their beliefs, maybe their biases, their attitudes, the way in which they view transfer, such that they see transfer students as just the amazing, like we said, wealth of capital individuals that are coming to their institutions, and see them as a member of their communities that are contributing in so many different ways. So NISTS is supporting those professionals in their efforts to assist transfer students in developing good policies, good practices for institutions to pursue, et cetera. So from that perspective, we do have a website that we encourage you all to visit, and it is just www.nists.org. You will find archives from several of our annual conferences. You'll see a link to the book that I mentioned, several other things. You'll see all the advisory board members. Every single one of those folks are working very diligently on behalf of transfer students. And we encourage the community of practitioners out there to help us build our cachet. And we're going to be working over the course of the next year to really get resources in the hands of people who make a difference in the lives of our transfer students.
Excellent. Well, I can feel the passion from each of you and appreciate the good work that you're doing. And thanks so much. This has been a great discussion. Thanks for sharing your time and your expertise today. And again, thank you for the leadership you're providing and the important work that you're doing to improve the lives of transfer students and your commitment to transfer student success.
Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Again, our guests today have been Janet Marling from the National Institute for the Study of Transfer Students, Alfred Herrera from UCLA, Dimple Jan from Cal State Northridge, and Mark Allen Poisel from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. Thank you, as always, to M. Stoner, which produces Higher Ed Live and makes these episodes possible. I'm Rob Zinkin. Thanks again for tuning in to Marketing Live on the Higher Ed Live Network.